So I have with me Dr. Stephen Hassan. He's a mental health professional and an expert on influence tactics used by authoritarian leaders and destructive cults. And that's just a short version. I'd love to get you to introduce yourself briefly, about some of the highlights of your experience, and we'll get into this conversation about cults and what happens to people's minds.
Sure. Briefly, I grew up in Flushing, Queens, New York, 1.3 miles from Donald Trump's childhood home, I might add. So I grew up knowing about Donald Trump as an asshole my whole life.
And the nanny.
And and I basically grew up in a conservative Jewish home, even though my last name is spelled like I'm a Muslim. I'm not. And was in the last draft lottery to go to Vietnam. Fortunately, got a high number. Hated Richard Nixon. I was at Queens College studying creative writing and writing poetry, and my girlfriend abruptly dumped me, and I was in the dumps, the blues, and I got approached by three flirting Mooney recruiter women pretending to be students at Queens College. And that sent me into a rabbit hole of radicalization where I became a right-wing fascist. And in 1974, thought God had chosen this fat Korean billionaire to be the Messiah to save the planet, and went and fasted for Nixon because God wanted him to be president, and I was made into a leader and heard these plans about how God thinks democracy is satanic and we have to infiltrate the government and take it over and impose a theocracy. And now we've been living this model for 50 years. The Moonies have the Washington Times Foundation, which a lot of people don't realize the Moonies are still around. They're big players. Mrs. Moon actually paid Donald Trump $2.5 million a few weeks after January 6th to endorse her. And she has two renegade sons in Pennsylvania, one with a gun cult, saying God wants us to have assault rifles, citing a verse in Revelations, and another one who has a gun factory. Anyway, I've written 4 books. I have a PhD. I have a model of authoritarian control that I'm hoping will update the legal system internationally using trafficking law. And I've experienced canceling since 1976 when I was deprogrammed from the Moonies and started speaking out. And the canceling first started as death threats, my physical death threats by the Moonies. And then it got worse as I spoke out against Scientology and a whole bunch of other very wealthy connected cults. And
Before South Park.
before South Park, I mean, I feel like I'm like you. I've been listening to a number of your interviews since you asked me for an interview, and I think that I have you to credit actually for having more courage to just think less about what the reactions are going to be and just speaking my truth. But so I'm an equal opportunity caller outer of bad actors.
That is something that I think is very much needed. It's sad that you get people who are caller outers of all sides tend to get criticized far more because there is no side that will claim you, because they're all getting a little bit of a taste of that medicine. So that's unfortunate because I think that's what we need. But what's really unique about your background is that you were someone who ended up, in a cult, in a very, very serious one. And today, I imagine that makes it different for you in how you approach even dealing with the people who might have been programmed by this.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing, one term that can characterize me as a wounded healer. And if it hadn't happened to me, I'd never believe that an intelligent, educated person from a nice family could become a right-wing fascist, thinking that democracy is satanic and it's fine to change the Constitution and kill everyone who doesn't agree with the group that I'm in. But that's I'm an MK Ultra 2.0 or 3.0 actually, because I can get into the whole intelligence agency dimension that I learned about with my former cult. And that's the big frame that's missing, I feel, which is why I have my podcast, The Influence Continuum, and I continue to message about this, is that we're walking around with out-of-date models for how the mind works. We walk around thinking we're rational beings, and we're not rational. We're emotional, and we're social, and we rationalize, but we have to make a great effort, what Kahneman called system 2 thinking, critical thinking, to analyze data, to separate our emotions from what are the facts, and to try to build a developmentally appropriate perspective on what's real and what's true.
That's what a psychologist would say in a session, right? What are the facts? Because everything else is a story we build around it. But people get so attached to the stories for the reasons that you mentioned, including tribe and identity and things like that. And they're not really looking for the facts, or at least they're looking maybe for facts that might support their conclusion, but they're not looking for, here are all the facts, just everything I know about this. Here's what's missing. People aren't doing that because they're motivated, and they get very angry. I noticed when you say, hey, you can't say, I tend to do this a lot and pisses people off, is I go, well, you can't say this because it's possible. Maybe what you're saying is true, but all you have is a hunch because you don't have the evidence to confirm it. And that alone gets people very angry. Why do you think, what makes them so angry at that?
I think we need a culture shift back to reality. I think that we're living in a world, and I want to say that in preparing for our session today, I listened to your interview with the military strategist, and I listened to your interview with the gender identity expert. I think it's Colin Wright.
Yeah.
Or
that was the first interview I did for this podcast, and I was very nervous at the time.
Yeah. So so what I want to say is that back 150 year, 1500 years ago, The Art of War was written, and the same principles are being used today, except now we have psychology, social psychology, neuroscience, digital media that's global, and supercomputers, AIs, and 5,000 data points on every voting citizen. So what we're now experiencing is psychological warfare at levels we have not been prepared for, and people have been unwittingly indoctrinated to believe really stupid ideas like you create your own reality. So if you create your own reality that you're a Martian, that's a guy sitting with a pink shirt talking to, Catherine, that ain't what's real. What's real is I'm Steve Hassan. I'm a PhD. I have 2 master's degrees. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm 70 years old, and I have a body of scholarly articles on how hypnosis can manipulate consciousness, how social psychology demonstrates cognitive biases that we have to make conscious and teach everyone so that we can learn how to control our own minds. And that's my motto, and why I call my company Freedom of Mind. I say it's your mind and only you should control it. And the only way to protect yourself is to understand what the bad actors know
Well,
and are
people
doing
think
to
that they
us.
have. I think almost people are more likely to fall into this trap because they think that they have the defenses and the critical thinking, and nobody can manipulate me. So when, for example, I talk about propaganda a lot, people don't think they criticize even the fact that I would bring something like propaganda because they think that it's almost diminishing their mental capacities, claiming that somebody's information can control them. And we see that a lot with, especially if we get into the topics of misinformation, disinformation, free speech. I think that I support free speech, but it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of mind traps when it comes to all of that. And do you think people are more susceptible to even self-hypnosis or being hypnotized by others through propaganda? I mean hypnosis in a more general way in terms of like the messaging and
So lots in there. Let me first say that there's a myth of invulnerability that people walk around with to feel safe. So, and the single most important principle of social psychology is called the fundamental attribution error. It's a lot of fancy words, but what it means is we're walking around with an unconscious bias when we're trying to understand other human behavior to overemphasize their personality variables or dispositional variables, and we underestimate the social, contextual, situational influence variables. So why did Steve get in the Moonies? He was weak, he was stupid, he didn't have a good religious upbringing. Instead of, Steve was a cocky little sucker at 19. He bicycled cross country at 16, and he skipped
he liked
eighth grade.
girls.
He liked girls a lot, and 3 women, I thought I could get lucky with one of them. And I literally asked, are you part of a religious group? And I don't know what about it made me ask, but they lied. They just looked me in the eyes and said, oh, no, not at all. So the myth of invulnerability, I say to anyone listening, if you think it could never happen to you, you're a sitting duck for someone who's sophisticated and understands neurolinguistic programming, NLP, or hypnosis. Next, I did 2 chapters on a clinical hypnosis textbook on the dark side of hypnosis. And what I want to say to your listeners is altered states of consciousness are normal for human beings. We are asleep, we're awake, but we have a lot of times during the day where we're daydreaming, we're
Driving.
somewhere else. Where highway hypnosis is one of the many things. And people who are high performance people, especially athletes, musicians, artists, writers, you need to learn how to go into an altered state to focus your attention, your concentration, your imagination. That state is a wonderful state. However, you're exceptionally vulnerable to outside influence. You're more suggestible if you're in an environment where someone has an agenda to install some false beliefs in you that you're not even conscious is happening. Not to mention psychedelics, which is a whole other area that I've gotten involved with. I had to, because so many people were being sexually assaulted by shamans and other would-be cult leaders who claim to know what's best for them, and me having sex with you is what's best for you right now.
Do you
And
think that people like to give up their power? Because that's something that I've noticed in the people that I've known who would join cult-like organizations, and following gurus. There's something appealing about, and they're not powerless people, but they like having some sort of a leader help guide them, I guess.
yeah, so what my answer is to that is I've been thinking about this for almost 5 decades, right? Since I got out, I've been doing lots of interviews. People ask me probing questions, and my answers today, as I heard you say on a previous interview you gave, this is the best I got at the moment, but I'm open to changing my mind. Show me the facts, and I'll be happy And I'm going to do a shout out for Adam Grant's book, Think Again, which I think is brilliant for everyone to read, because
Right.
he says, separate your ego from your beliefs, pursue facts and truth, and you'll be okay, and be open to changing your mind, because nobody knows the truth with a capital T. And when people say they know the truth with a capital T, put your antenna up and going, warning, warning. Will
Oh, but I can
Robinson.
see it with my 2 eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so I'll tell a quick I'll do a quick tangent on the man who's now my assistant, who I helped out of a cult 31 years ago, and my virtual assistant, and he got into a cult by Zen Master Rama. And this guy was in a cult. Sri Chinmoy left it, started his own cult, claimed to be an enlightened master from the continent of Atlantis. And he was hypnotizing his followers, saying, I'm teaching you meditation. And when you're truly ready to meet your teacher, you'll see a golden light emanating from his body. Well, guess what? When people get into the cult, they isolate from their family and friends, drop out of school, and they see the golden light. And when I was asked to meet with Jim, I never tell people if they say they had a spiritual experience. I never say, no, you didn't. But I always offer an alternative explanation for them to consider. Because my whole method of helping people to reality test isn't to persuade them. It's to share my journey and my knowledge and ask them questions that make them think about their experience. So it's people change themselves, not me changing them. And I said to him, Jim, consider the possibility that with hypnosis, there's this thing called positive hallucination, where you can tell somebody they're going to see something that isn't there. But when they're in a trance state, they'll see it. Oh, no. This wasn't a hypnosis, Steve. This was a real spiritual experience. I said, well, consider the other possibility. He said to me, prove it. And I was like, oh, shit, what do I do now? And I said, and I just said, I want you to close your eyes and meditate the way Rama taught you to meditate. So he closes his eyes, and I did. This was the tricky thing that I did. I did what's called a double bind. I said, Jim, and I didn't use a velvet voice of hypnosis, like you can really speak in a very velvety voice. Anyway, I just said, I want you to meditate deeper than you've ever done before. And when you're fully ready, I want you to open your eyes and see a brighter light coming from me. Okay, so I more or less put him in a double bind that he'd have to be meditating for the rest of his life, or the option was to see the brighter light. So within 5 minutes, he opened his eyes and went, whoa, it's even brighter than Rama's. That's it. I'm out. I got to get my friends out now. And I'm like, go, Jim. Rock
That's
on,
amazing.
dude. And he's a filmmaker now. Anyway, to answer your question, right now on the internet, and I did an interview with Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin for your Undivided Attention podcast. I love humanetech.com. And we even did a blog or something on how social media induces hypnotic states. And Asa invented doom scrolling, not realizing it was going to harm people to have infinite scrolls, but people lose 2 hours. And guess what? In hypnotic states, time distortion is one of the telltale signs that you're in a hypnotic state. But the key thing I want to emphasize, and then I'll shut up for a minute and let you talk, is that hypnosis is great, but are you in control or is it someone else? And you need to still have critical thinking. You can't just go with the flow, because imagination can take you down very deep rabbit holes.
No, absolutely. And in my head, I was going, I'm not very easily hypnotizable, but as you were saying, scrolling and losing time, I absolutely do that. I drive sometimes and don't notice. So I know that's again one of those things. If you think that you can't be penetrated, then you're more likely to be. The closest I've come to cults are, well, I went to Scientology and they wouldn't accept me, but I think they could tell that I was being a bit of an ass. But and I used to I don't know why, but I used to be really into researching cults. And but where I recognized similar structures, one was sort of a under the guise of a success of a business training. I was forced to go by one of my employers. I had to
Yeah, large
recently.
group awareness training cult. Yep, go
Yep.
on.
So I went to that. I think that I was just such a stick that I don't think they pushed very hard to get me, but you could see what they do. Like they'll find traits of yours that you might be insecure. Okay, maybe you don't work hard enough, and this stuff feels like a hard, cold truth. And actually, they're giving you tough love. And then you see people hugging each other, and you have that environment. I've also experienced similar things with, I studied acting, and some of my acting teachers, I would say, had a bit of a, because if you disagreed with something, and I had one teacher in particular where if I just, I got a phone call from him, how dare I disagree? And that, I don't think they were like cults with specifically the teachers. I wouldn't say were like cult structures, but they had some signs that were similar. And I guess that's where I'd love to get in with you, is like, okay, so there are things like the Moonies where it's much more obvious to know that's a cult because it's got that
Oh,
structure.
it's a religious cult. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's that category, but I know of at least two acting coaches who were malignant narcissists. We should, describe the stereotypical profile of cult leaders. And let me just say that chapter 3 of my re-release of The Cult of Trump, with the forward by George Conway, chapter 3, I compare Trump with my former cult leader, Sun Myung Moon, Jim Jones of People's Temple, and Hubbard of Scientology. And Eric Fromm was analyzing Hitler when he came up with malignant narcissist frame. And on my freedomofmind.com website, you can download the list if you want the quickie. Study that list, and you'll protect yourself from 80% of all predators or predatory organizations, just to know that one thing. But
Yeah.
what I want to say is you can have a one-on-one cult with a narcissist where someone just takes over someone else. It can be China, and 1.5 billion people run in an authoritarian mind control way. So I have two intersecting models, Catherine. One's called the Influence Continuum, that shows ethical influence is here, unethical is here. These are the criteria of ethical influence, like informed consent, respect for your individuality, your conscience, your free will to read whatever you want to read, talk to whoever you want to talk to, and leave without fear or harassment, all the way to the authoritarian destructive end, which, now I'll speak as a mental health professional, is best described as a dissociative disorder. And what I mean by that is that when I was recruited into the Moonies, I was taught I needed to be reborn in God, that the old Steve was evil and satanic. Milton and Estelle Hassan were my physical parents, but Moon and his wife were my true parents. And this new self took over my old self. Think about how computers can get hacked by malware through deception, take over your operating system. That's the easiest way to think about what happens when somebody gets radicalized, is their self gets taken over and programmed to be dependent and obedient. And now I'm going to answer your question about people wanting to be led or directed. And for me, on that influence continuum, if you were lucky enough to be raised on the healthy side of that by your family, and your family wasn't in a religious cult of some kind, You were being encouraged to grow up, to think for yourself, to become your true self. If you were gay, you were accepted. That it was developmentally appropriate parenting aimed at helping you grow up to be an adult. Too many people, though, are raised in authoritarian families where they're corporally punished and they're made to be obedient and told, you can't wear this, you can't say this, and very programmed. And when these folks get older, developmentally, they haven't had that maturity and that making mistakes and figuring things that I can figure this out on my own, or I have a network that I can ask to reality test about. These folks are still primed to follow the leader. They're looking for a daddy figure, authority figure to tell them what is reality. Now, that said, I will say even for people like myself who was raised on the ethical side, if you can sleep deprive someone, if you can create enough hypnotic experiences where you assault the person's sense of identity and what's up and what's down. And by the way, the Matrix movies have been used by every mind control cult I have ever worked with, including ISIS. You may think you know what reality is, but it's not. And then they subvert what they're doing. They replace it as if that what they have is the truth, and it's anything but. So to answer your question, when you are assaulted with this indoctrination into a pseudo self, your age regressed to childhood. So my Mooney identity was a child. I was literally told to be a child, to father, true father, and to please father no matter what he asked me to do, even if it meant killing myself or killing someone else, mindlessly doing it. And so when I got out of the Moonies after a near-fatal van crash, and I learned about Chinese communist brainwashing and Robert J. Lifton's 1961 book in his 8 criteria, I was like, holy crap. We're doing exactly what the Chinese communists were doing. But we're God and they're Satan. This does not compute. And it opened the doors to my mind to go, holy crap, what have I been following? Moon's a liar. He's not trustworthy. And we have about 70 million Americans, maybe less, but 70 million thinking Trump is being used by God. And it's like, hello, I've been in this story.
Right. So let's talk about that, because I've had some arguments and I am open to being corrected. So what I see in some of the people who follow Trump, there is a cult-like behavior. So what I see is when they're unable to criticize him, when they do view him as sort of godlike or chosen, anointed by God, there is that mind frame. Some people will argue that, MAGA is an actual cult. Where do you stand, I guess, on that? Do you see it more as a pattern of behavior that's more cult-like? Or do you actually think it meets the criteria of being cult? Obviously, you wrote a book called The Cult of Trump, so I sort of have an inkling.
So the surprise feature of my research when I was asked with Simon & Schuster to write the book was that there are actual authoritarian cults that comprise the cult of Trump. Like, I did not understand when I first took the assignment. I knew he was a malignant narcissist. That's what I knew for sure. I didn't understand that he had been recruited by Russia as an asset, and that he had a puppet master for a long time who had been rescuing him from all his failed business things. Like
There's
that.
a particular person, or?
Well, Yuri Shvets, who was the main resource for Craig Unger in his book American Compromat with a K. I did 2 interviews with them on this book, but his behavior is all pro-Russia. I mean, then we can go back to the Mueller investigation even earlier. But just to finish the frame, I wrote about the family that Jeffrey Charlotte wrote 2 best-selling books and a Netflix 5-part series. This is the cult that does the national prayer breakfasts and recruits Democrats and Republicans to their extremist stuff. I wrote about Opus Dei. The biggest network of cults is called New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR, that the media has mischaracterized as Christian evangelicals. Christian evangelicals say, no, they're a cult. These are people who say, I'm a prophet, I'm an apostle, and I can speak to God, and God told me Trump won the election. And I can speak in tongues to prove that I speak with God, and I can cast out demons and do faith healings. We're looking at 30 to 40 million Americans in these mega churches, and they're following their prophet who says God wants Trump in. So when we're thinking about how do we access all the people who are Trump supporters, well, there's maybe some people who are just listening to Fox all day long or following, their politician who says that the election was stolen.
Which would be equivalent, I would say, to, similarly, people loving Obama or even Harris, in the sense that they might not know that much about it and are thinking about it uncritically. But what you're
Absolutely.
saying is that there's a network where what makes it as structures that, okay, go ahead.
So this is on my website. You can download it for free. Are there cults on the ethical side? Obama, Clinton, Taylor Swift? Sure. But we're social beings as humans. We like to be part of groups. I'm part of a Jewish community. I'm part of a scuba diving community. I'm a part of a global ex-member survivor community of, I got out too. Yay.
Yeah.
Right? So the point is, I say cults exist along the entire continuum. My concern is the authoritarian mind control cults that say the ends justify the means, ignore your conscience, will turn on you if you don't agree with everything we're telling you to do.
Right. So when
And
you're saying like Trumpism is a cult, is more so in the sense of, because the examples that you gave of some of these organized entities that behave in a very structured cult way. So the people who would be following those would be in a cult, essentially.
and people who are afraid to think negative thoughts. Like when people say, oh, I'm not in a cult, and I know they're in the Church Universal and Triumphant or some other group that Falun Gong, I say, tell me 3 things you don't like about the leader. And you see their eyes glaze over because they're not allowed to think or say anything negative against their leader. I have no problem saying bad things about Obama or Biden or whatever, because I'm a human being and I don't expect perfection. The whole system needs to be revamped along ethical lines. We all need to grow our consciences and our empathy factors again and come back to science. And here's another thing I want to say, since you've invited me to share your platform. I wrote about in The Cult of Trump this guy named William Lynch in 1980s came up with a thing called 4th generation psychological warfare. And he paired up with a Christian right-wing strategist named Paul Weyrich. And what this propaganda, this psychological warfare was about wasn't to convince the other side to come to your beliefs. No, it was to attack experts, to attack science, and to attack democratic institutions. So it was an all-out assault on what people, the organization of society. Don't trust your experts who spent their lives studying something. Science is a cult. Don't trust science. It's like science is what's gotten us to where we are as a species, right?
Well, this is a difficult, so this is an area that, so I looked at, statistically, trust in organizations, not organizations, institutions is at the lowest it's ever been. And that's both reflected in the views of the left and the right, and wherever you are on the spectrum. But um, there is, I've spent some time criticizing some institutions. Like, I'll criticize, because I'm a journalist, I've criticized what some of the issues that I see in journalism. I do think there were certain mistakes, particularly around communication and transparency, and say the health side of things, especially during the pandemic, that I think has cost a lot of trust. I think there are issues, and I think it's fair game to criticize. But what I've noticed is that a lot of people have gone from criticizing things on merit to completely dismissing all of these institutions. So they'll say things like, if I read about it in the New York Times or CNN or whatever, I know it's the opposite,
Right.
which is a ridiculous belief. Or, experts, all the experts lie to us. Well, no, most experts do a great job. I think we could be doing a better job at choosing which experts we elevate based on their experience. But to say that some random person who's Googled things, is now more knowledgeable than someone who's dedicated their lives to the pursuit of, particularly in science, where it's very deep knowledge, where they might spend, 10, 20, 30, 40 years just researching one microorganism, right?
Right.
That's ludicrous. But we are living in this society where we have such a low trust. And I almost feel guilty that I've criticized the institutions, although I think it's still the right thing to do when they're doing the wrong thing. But
Right.
but people have taken that and amplified it to, it's all bad.
So again, because I spent the morning listening to you in previous interviews, I like to think I have a sense of you and your framing. And what I'd like to say to you in terms of what I've arrived at after all these decades is that I no longer think in terms of left and right. I think of authoritarianism on the left, authoritarianism on the right, and I think more about expanding the middle that is grounded with feet on the ground, willing to listen, willing to consider other points of view, and not this simplistic. And I have, a bite model, BITE. This is all on my website for free. This is how you can judge an authoritarian thing. Under thought control, a cult identity is black and white, us versus them, good versus evil, simple. So there's no coloration in the middle. There's some of this and there's some of that, which is closer to reality. It's all or nothing. So the institution is wrong, or scientific journal articles were fraudulently reporting results that they didn't have. That's terrible. It doesn't mean give up on science. It means that the institutions that were publishing this were flawed or bought off, or someone didn't double check. And that's what's so beautiful about the scientific method, is there's no truth. It's all hypotheses that we then test. And we're willing to abandon hypotheses when there's a better hypothesis that we can test. And the test has to come from the community that's testing it. Like my bite model, I knew was successful because I wrote about it in 1988 in my first book, Combating Cult Mind Control. And people would read the book and walk out after 30 years, 40 years in a cult. They're like, I was reading this book because I knew the Moonies were a cult, but damn, I underlined the whole book. It's all about my group. How did he do this? And it's like, I didn't know about this guy's group. I was just writing about what I learned about. So the thing is if it's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. What I say to everybody listening here is, if you think that the controversies of your group or your beliefs, if there's controversy about it, step back, disconnect, study the models, study the bite model, study Lifton. I just put up an interview with this 98-year-old mentor of mine that saved my life when I got out of the Moonies, because I read his book and he met with me. And I literally just interviewed him on Friday, so it just came out today. But like the point is have faith that if it's true, it will stand up to scrutiny. If it isn't, then what are you spending your time and energy? Giving money, recruiting people, or being so adamant about it. And lastly, I'll say I did a TEDx talk for John Werner at MIT. How can I know if I've been brainwashed? For anyone to watch, and it has a 4-step reality testing strategy. And part of it is disconnecting, learning about authoritarian mind control models, then seeking out critics and former members and really listening to their point of view. And then combining that with your own experience, you can answer the question. Go back in time before you got recruited into your current beliefs and go, if I knew then what I know now, would I have ever said yes? And if the answer is no, then it's time to leave. And there's no shame in leaving. In fact, it's glorious. You're free. You don't have to,
Oh, but you lose your community. And that seems to be
Yeah,
like
but
I was doing some reading about different people who've left these cults but also like why they joined them. And a lot of times it didn't even have to do, and these were like hateful, very, racist. It wasn't even so much that these people shared these beliefs. It was that sense of belonging. Now they had this community.
Yeah, so there's a sense of belonging, but it's a false sense, because when you're in a mind control cult and you start verbalizing questions about the glorious leader or the policies, everyone turns on you like rabid dogs and you're the enemy. That's not how friends should be. If you're with friends and you have a different point of view, your friends are still your friends. And they don't say, no, you're evil and I can never talk to you again. And that's another telltale sign you're in an authoritarian cult. If you're afraid that everyone's going to turn on you and no longer want to be your buddy.
That's kind of how I felt at times, not even being in a full-on cult, but just being in a particular communities where if you said the wrong thing, the thing that people disagreed with, people did turn on you.
I have that experience too. So you got accused of being a transphobe. Guess what? Me too.
I didn't
And
actually get that one, but
I got that one when I was asked by a therapist who contacted me a number of years ago. She said, "Steve, are you aware combating cult mind control is being cited by detransitioners?" And I'm like, "What's a detransitioner?" Oh, they're somebody who thought they were the other sex, took hormones, maybe had surgery, and then they realized they weren't. And I'm like, what? I said, I'm gay friendly. I'm trans friendly. What are you talking about? And she's like, yeah, but there are these people who are leaving and they're now being canceled by all their best friends in the trans community. And I said, give me some names. Let me talk to some of these folks. And I did. And I found out I talked to 12 people at the time. Half were raised in homophobic churches or religious institutions with no sex ed, and there was no room to be gay. And they were gay, basically. Some were on the autism spectrum, high functioning autism. And I studied that because folks on the spectrum are particularly susceptible to mind control cultism. And I did a free webinar for folks at aane.org on that. And then there was a very interesting group who were like, well, we were just binge watching YouTube videos of transitioners, and we were stoned out of our gourd, and then we started watching hypno-porn, and I'm like, hypno-porn, what's that?
Okay.
Oh, it's porn that will help you transition. I'm like, what? I said,
I just learned something new.
I'm an expert in hypnosis. Like, send me some links. So Steve Hassan went on Pornhub
Oh
And I
no.
watch these and I'm like, this is military grade brainwashing. This is not frivolous kink. This is indoctrinating people to believe they're in the wrong body. And I said, this is really dangerous.
And
And
group dynamics too,
and
right?
so I did this, and I had the Cult of Trump book. I was focused on Trump, but I was like, holy crap, this is a real problem. I can't ignore it or deny it. And then on Twitter, a detransitioner messaged, and I quote retweeted, and I said, I interviewed some folks, and they genuinely were unduly influenced in this case. And man, and J.K. Rowling followed me and
Well,
retweeted
now
me.
it's official.
And then it was like, Steve's an evil person. You can't
Yeah.
trust him. He's a transphobe and blah, 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 blah. And then one more thing that I want to go out of my way to say, because so much is about cancel culture. I dared to hold up this book and say, this is a really good novel about cults. They really did their research. And people are like, Steve, that's J.K. Rowling. How could you endorse her? You're a transphobe. I'm like, this is a good book. And she mentioned combating cult mind control in my name and my mentor in the book. And so I was like, but this is a good book. This is going to be made into a movie.
And
That's
it's good because it's so big.
no, it's really masterful storytelling, but I endorsed it. And just the fact that I endorsed something that J.K. Rowling wrote,
That was
I'm
enough.
evil. And
Well,
I'm
that
like,
was
my
the
son,
topic.
who's gay, grew up learning to read Harry Potter. Like, I'm
Yeah.
indebted to her.
Well, that was the topic that I think for me was the scariest one to breach. And the reason I said I was nervous on that first interview was specifically because it was on a topic where I was the most nervous to speak. I didn't tweet about it. I thought, okay, long form conversation. At least we can make things clear, and it won't just get taken out of context, which is laughable. Of course, it will. But it's but that's such a serious problem that we can't talk about certain things where actually we're look, there's a lot of people who are transphobic, who are horrible to people, but there's a lot of people who actually want the best, and therefore we want to be able to talk about the issues that actually exist. We want to prevent harm from being caused to people
Right.
who might be identifying falsely, as well as the people who have dysphoria, that are dysphoric and need assistance in some way.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the people I interviewed was a man who was a psychology student. When I interviewed him, he said, Steve, I transitioned to be a woman at 19, and I've been taking estrogen for 20 years, and my penis and testicles are removed, and I realized I had gender dysmorphia, and I'm a man, and I have a girlfriend now, and I want my equipment back, and I can't have it. And this is the thing that really moved me, was he said, I wanted to share my experiences. I think it was at WASP, one of the big organizational meetings that were concerned about transgender rights. And they canceled him and said, no, you can't share your experience. And that is culty,
It is culty.
very
That is culty.
culty to say, no, your 20-year experience is not valid because we don't want people to know about it. And it's like,
No,
huh?
we should be able to equally listen to the people. I know some people where they transition really young, actually, and have really happy, productive lives, right?
Yes.
That exists. And then there's
Yep.
people where that's not the case. And if we can't talk about all of them, then we're not looking for the truth ultimately. And if we're not looking for the truth, then how do we know that we're doing the right things for the best possible outcomes? And that
Exactly.
should be the guiding star.
Exactly. And as a mental health professional, one of the first things you're taught is do no harm. And the
Yeah.
second thing you're taught is, if you're not trained to help somebody with a particular problem, get supervision or make a referral. And people have no training in learning about authoritarian mind control cults. Zero. So I created an online course to at least begin a fundamental education for people who want to understand. And so many clinicians are like, holy mackerel, I've had ex-Mormons in my practice, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, people from Jewish extremist, Hasidic sects, etc. And I'm like, yeah, the whole world needs to understand the differences between healthy and unhealthy, and how to ask questions in a way that you can figure out how to help empower people to help themselves and to get out of therapy. The goal of a good therapist is to help the person function, not to keep them in therapy forever. That's called the therapy cult. If you're
Say
in
that again for the people in the
No, I'm telling you that, someone just emailed me this morning about Jeffrey Masson's book, Against Therapy, and he was in charge of the Freud archives, and Freud turned out to be a real problematic figure who lied about some of his stories and was a coke addict and would keep people in psychoanalysis for a really long time. He said, children were being raped, and then he took it back. Is like,
Oh.
there's a lot of problems with Freud. I mean, he's largely credited as teaching us about the unconscious, but we really need to just keep learning and growing and focus on planetary survival. And
Well,
and
a
and
sign of a
that's the
great,
key, is we want to
yeah.
survive together. We're on one planet together. We have to learn civility. We have to learn compromise.
I think a sign of a healthy society is how much how much does a court gesture allow to say, and are they allowed to speak? And in authoritarian societies or communities, that's not the case.
Yeah, people will turn you in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Hitler Youth were turning their parents in. They were turning their neighbors in, right? So it's like, let's learn from history. Let's learn about Mussolini and Hitler, and let's look at what's happening today, and let's not close our eyes to the parallelisms. And Trump is saying he's going to have a dictatorship if he gets power, and he will cheat, and we can count on that cheating. So then the issue is, are we going to, in the next 43 days or whatever we have left before the election, we need to mobilize a lot of people who've never registered to vote early, and to be especially voting in all the battleground states, and to be prepared for chaos, because they want, they meaning the dictators and the authoritarians. Catherine, may I make one more quick comment back
Sure.
to your thing about free speech? So I'm
Sure.
all for free speech, but the law is very clear that it is a crime to cry fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire, because it causes harm. You're not allowed to cry fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. So the organization FIRE, which is funded by the Koch corporate empire, who I have spoken out against, and I interviewed the man who wrote the book called Kochland. This is a corporate cult that's into fossil fuels. And my former cult, the Moonies, has used the Washington Times to do 50 years of climate science denial. Just as the big tobacco is saying, oh no, smoking doesn't cause cancer, let's have some experts say so, they've been using so-called experts to put out disinformation. And what I say to the Kochs and what I say to FIRE is, if you really are for free speech, let's talk about the Kochs and how the father was a John Bircher. And let's talk about fossil fuels killing our planet and how we need to shift quickly. And all of a sudden, they don't want free speech. They don't want to talk about fossil
I'm
fuels or.
actually surprised. I didn't know they were funded by, because I have kind of looked at FIRE in a pretty positive way. I don't know about the. I thought it wasn't true that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, but there
You're
are
not
real.
allowed to, and you're not allowed to say that Trump won the election when he didn't, when it's
But
absolutely
I think it
proven.
is. I mean, it is like legally free speech. Anything outside of incitement of violence, which is very loosely defined in a way, or very specifically defined rather, is actually free speech legally. What we think is appropriate or not, that's a different thing
It
from
is
the
illegal
First
to
Amendment.
scream fire in a crowded theater. Whether this Supreme Court, who was put in place by Opus Dei and the Federalist Society, which is one of the many cults, and I have an interview with a UK journalist who has a book coming out next week on Opus Dei that will blow your mind. Must reading for everybody who wants to understand some of the more powerful forces that are happening in the US and around the world. But again, if you're for free speech, have me on talking about the cult of Trump.
Well,
Have me
and that's
on
kind of the thing
Greg
where all these free
Lukinoff.
speech podcasts, I've noticed that they won't have, I mean, they don't really have, they have on people they already agree with. Like people love Tucker Carlson and they're like, he's a free speech person and he's for the truth. But yet, and I know he's been offered, certain people offered to go on to disagree, to give a different perspective, and he never had interest in that. So that to me tells you that it's not. So this kind of false, because I'll talk to people who disagree with me. I'm happy to.
Me
It's
too.
actually interesting. Yeah.
Me too.
Um,
Because
but
I
it's
like to learn. I like to grow.
exactly
You don't grow by
that should
only
be
talking to people who agree with you. Please.
exactly that should be the mindset. And and I think that when I see someone not having a diversity in their guests and thoughts, where I know they have the opportunity to, because I understand,
I
like, it's,
volunteered. I emailed Greg when I listened to the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, which
yeah.
I thought was very well done, actually. I said, "Hey, you're for free speech. How about having me on? I'm a mind control victim of the U.S. CIA and the Korean CIA. I have a lot to say about what I've learned." And zippity doo dah. Maybe he's
Actually,
listening.
I am sad to hear that. I've interviewed Greg on this podcast, and I thought of FIRE as an organization that seems to fight for, because they've supported free speech of a side that I don't agree with, and I think it's good.
I'm all for free speech.
Yeah.
Let me speak against fossil fuel, this climate science denial. Let me speak against Ayn Rand and objectivism and libertarianism and what's wrong with it. But
You should
they're
go in the
afraid.
podcast for Anne Rand, and I was on one for my book. And disagree. That would be such an interesting conversation, actually.
I'm available. We can do something in the future. We need more people like yourself saying, you know what? Let's stop self-censoring our feelings and our thoughts. Oh, here's one last thing. I know we're coming up on an
Yeah.
hour, but have you heard of the Asch conformity study?
No, I don't. I don't think
Solomon
so.
Asch. Go on YouTube, ASCH conformity study. So this social psychologist did the study in the 50s, and it's been replicated forever. And the people in a room are shown a series of cards, placards, with a sample size line and 3 other sample size lines of differing lengths. And they go around the room asking which of the 3 lines is equal to the same size as the sample size line. Okay? But everyone is in on the experiment except the sucker in seat 6. And it's not a visual perception experiment, it's a conformity experiment. And Asch wanted to see how many people would start giving the wrong answer just to fit in when they could see with their own eyes what the correct answer was. And the golden number is 2/3 start giving the wrong answer. A small percentage give it confidently, give the wrong answer confidently, right? But a reason I'm bringing this up now is there's this third called heroic resistors. And they're people like yourself, I characterize you based on what I know of you, that are looking at it and going, I don't know what they're seeing, but number 2 is the right answer, not 3 or not 1. But they're almost embarrassed or ashamed. Their face gets all scrunched up, but they keep giving the right answer. And at the end of the experiment, when it's explained that heroic resistors are beaming, yes, I stood up for the truth. And the other ones were like, oh, I knew I shouldn't have said it, and I was going along to fit in, and they felt like crap. And so I want to create a culture of heroic resistors like you, and I think like myself, that speak and say, hey, we have this goal, survival, planetary survival. Let's focus on that. And that requires we're going to have to figure out how to live together. And we have to learn how to deal with psychological warfare leveled at us from our enemies or from authoritarians that want to take over the country, get rid of government regulations so they can keep pushing fossil fuels and kill our planet, and be racist and Christian nationalists, etc. It's like, no. Let's go back to the founders and the original idea of separation of church and state, and let's create a Supreme Court that has some balance and not operating by cult edict. Anyway, that's my rant towards the end.
Well, I think that's a great one to end on. I could ask you a million questions and talk to you forever, but we can't do that. But I really appreciate you joining me. And look, and I know that some people listening to this will feel a little triggered by some of the things because of their beliefs, but I hope you consider it.
I hope people get curious, though, after they get triggered and go, I wonder what some of these things the guy said I agree with, some I don't. And they come to my Substack, which I made free till the election, and read my blog on Coax, and read my on Fire, and read my stuff on Ayn Rand and everything else. And
I think the best way to kind of look, like I've noticed myself having skeptical thoughts at certain points because I don't know the facts, right? So my thinking process is, okay, so I'm hearing this, I don't know this, let me check this. And I hope that people, when that's the case, I hope that's what people do. They kind of pause, not deny it outright, but go, okay, let me gather more information and see if it stands. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. It's okay, but let's at least give that a chance.
And have faith in your intelligence. You can sort out what's true and what's bull.
Yes, based on facts.
Right.
What are the facts? It always comes down to that question.
Yep.
So again, pleasure. You have like 4 books, so some great things to read. Your Substack. I'll put all the links and information. And again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me so much. Continued success. Bye.
I'm just